Right, well, let's start tying some of these threads together. You've talked about the problems in the Middle East, you've talked about 911. So, how does this all tie in with the bankers?
It does tie in with the bankers, and I will mention before that the secret lodges, because I want to take this back away from the America of Pashenik, and I've no doubt that he had reason to say what he said, and we'd like to hear more from him. But I want to talk about Mazzini and Pike going back into the 1800s. I have looked at a prophecy which Pike wrote, which mentions the two towers, and I have decoded that in the book, so I'm not going to try and explain that. But it would appear that Albert Pike, who's a grandmaster in America in the 1800s, and Mazzini, who is this world terrorist, they were working together, and Pike produced this prophecy of the fall of the two towers. Like I said to you, all that we're seeing, I believe, was planned in blueprint and outline in the 1700s. So I'm taking a rather different line anyway from what you would perhaps expect. And then Mazzini and Pike had letters together about the three world wars, World War I, World War II, and World War III, which they spelt out in considerable detail. So that is also sort of thrown into the pot, because the bankers and the lodges actually always work together, and it would appear that Red Masonry was aware of 9/11 events and was also prepared to sort of write about it in a very concealed kind of way. So that's in the book as part of trying to unwrap what occurred, that 9/11 was actually a logical step in a process that led up from War 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and then a 7, with this being the sort of early days of the bankers trying to cause another global war. Now, looking at these mega bankers, immersed as they have been in war making in the past, and that's all, it's not controversial, it's all written down anyway, seem to have latched onto this 7-war idea from the War of Independence, Red Lodges working in the War of Independence, French Revolution with the same Red Lodges working away, American Civil War, same pattern, with Rothschild and Astor becoming visible in the American Civil War, Mazzini over there making sure the war took place alongside the president, Russian Revolution, same Red Lodges, and involved in that because it didn't work very well, Rothschild, Rockefeller, Jacob Schiff, J.P. Morgan, Warburg's American International Company, AIC, Fabian Society Round Table Lodges. So we're beginning to sort of build up a picture, and later on you'll be able to read, if you want to, about World War II and how that was planned, because it's quite relevant. We know a lot about that, and it's very similar to what's going on in the Middle East today. And then you've got the Muslim Brotherhood, again, the same as in the 1700s and 1800s, being wound up clearly by mega bankers, and the Red Lodges, which were set up at the same time in 1710. So you've got this sort of swirl and background, and I've mentioned those people who were attached to the Russian Revolution. So now we come to this long, ghastly sort of debacle in the Middle East. First, there's the same banker, Rothschild, and we're not talking about a specific person, as I mentioned in the book. We're talking about these copper lines that conduct the electricity of war. A manager for the Rothschilds, a major manager of the Rothschilds, was called Hartmann. And he ran the BCCI Bank of London, as elsewhere, which paid for terrorism and also spread nuclear knowledge in the Middle East. Not controversial. It's in the American reports. Then comes Rockefeller, again, second one from the Russian Revolution, whose Brzezinski created world terrorism and set it off at Afghanistan with calamitous results, because we've now got these armed people all over the place. Then there's J.P. Morgan, again, Russian Revolution, who was heading the Round Table in America, along with, well, of course, the other bankers like Rockefeller. And it's these groups, this extension of the Round Table, Council of Foreign Relations, Bilderberg and Trilaterate, that formed the Planning the New American Century, which was a very aggressive plan for world domination and first strike advocates of war. Then there's the Warburg-Pincus element. Warburg funded the Russian Revolution, that hired Rockefeller's friend Kissinger, who came up with this extraordinary arc of evil, clash of civilizations. And then there's Jacob Schiff, Russian Revolution, who created the Schofield Bible, which is actually currently being used to wind up ideas of Armageddon. We haven't accounted for the dodgy Quran, although we know when that was started by East India agent Mr. Hempher in 1710, but we can't tell exactly who is behind the printing of that today. Now, this is not controversial. The scholars of Islam, who are great people, will tell you the Quran has been changed and not for the better. And that's just local volumes of the Quran. It doesn't mean the whole thing. So unrest in the Middle East and a series of wars has been partnered by this, we'll call it splinter CIA trilaterate units, and has involved those named as funders both of the European Union, Russian Revolution, and the Hitler era. As I said, we're tracing the electricity, not the wires. And this electricity goes to the Round Table in Britain, and then off to Europe, where it's all interconnected through the British-American project. Pashenik has blamed those named in America for 9/11 as that attack not being genuinely from abroad, and he has called for a court to override the 9/11 inquiry and to look at the facts again. And Kissinger was, as I said earlier, explained he was part of a rogue empire, not involved with Bush, and he said only America and Britain would understand what he was saying.
I just want to say something about Kissinger. There are many people who are quite young who are probably listening to this and don't realise his history. And he went to America as a young boy, but he managed to worm his way into the administration as, I presume, a stooge of the bankers, because he seems to have a finger in every pie. But I'd just like to say one quote of Henry Kissinger, which I think people who sort of think they're being patriotic by supporting the military need to register. And he's said to have said it to Haig, and it is, military men are just dumb, stupid animals to be used as pawns in foreign policy. And I think that just sums it up, the way they treat the military.
Well, that's an interesting quote, and one would say that if you create terrorists and arm terrorists, then it may be that your army is going to have to face that particular problem. So we don't have a problem with armies and navies and the Air Force. What we're trying to do is look beneath the surface and see these things being deliberately formed so that people have to react to them. And I thought I might just slip in here a comment by Nick Rockefeller to filmmaker Aaron Russo about the plan to microchip the population. And Rockefeller warned him about an event that would allow us to invade Afghanistan and Iraq, and this was some 11 months before 9/11. And also foretold the fact that the war on terror would be a hoax, wherein soldiers would be looking in caves for non-existent enemies. Rockefeller also, of course, tried to recruit Aaron Russo into the Council of Foreign Relations. So there we are. There's lots to think about, and I always think there's an awful lot to investigate, and I'm sort of wondering why this isn't going on right now. Now, I want to just sort of draw this to a little bit of a conclusion, because I'm not going to look to this particular event I'm going to describe as how things will happen, or rather how it's hoped they will happen, because it may not be like this. But I have talked a lot about Armageddon, the Middle East being wound up for some significant purpose, which seems to be beyond taking over country after country. We seem to be moving towards some sort of conclusion. So let me just sort of say this at the end, which is a warning really for people to be on the alert, to sow peace, to be very careful about who is an authority, to start examining banks and where the money's going, and particularly to look at who is funding this continued process of terrorism, if other than the Trilateral Commission. Israeli police turned back members on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, called Land of Israel Faithful Movement, as they attempted to enter the Dome of the Rock there in Jerusalem and to anoint the cornerstone of a third temple in Jerusalem. Now, this area, of course, is sacred to Islam too. So the Schofield Bible, which wants Armageddon, actually does mention the third temple nonsense. Had the Israeli authorities allowed these Temple Mount fanatics to carry out their provocation, the Dome of the Rock and the Al-Aqsa Mosque, being amongst the holiest sites in Islam, and target to scores of terrorist attacks by right-wing Jewish Temple Mount terrorists, a holy war of incalculable consequence would have erupted. Executive Intelligence Review explained that a certain Lord N is, by his own admission, a practitioner of the satanic rituals of Aleister Crowley, and here we see yet another connection between subversive groups, Satanism, and what is going on. Crowley, of course, was part of the English set of John Yarker, which sowed lodges all over Europe, eventually to start World War II. So in 1995, the Jerusalem Freemasonic Lodge was formed close to the Temple Mount, again, intending to rebuild Solomon's Temple. And of course, this is just the act of war. In Michael Leedon's book, War Against Terror Masters, he states, the awesome power of a free society committed to a single mission is something our enemies cannot imagine. our unexpectedly quick and impressive victory in Afghanistan is a prelude to a much broader war, which will, in all likelihood, transform the Middle East for at least a generation and reshape the politics of many older countries around the world. So we have to look at Leiden and his connections. He was often quoted daily by people like Dick Cheney, Donald Rumsfeld, Paul Wolfowitz. Then, as now, Leiden was calling for regime change beyond Iraq and stated the time for diplomacy is at an end. It is time for a free Iran, a free Syria, a free Lebanon. He is also the same person who called for the United States to wage war against Iran, Syria, Lebanon, Sudan, Libya, because he alleges they are masters of terror. Now, you've got to connect in these things and the build-up of nasty lodges around the dome and the involvement of people like Leiden. I've put what that involvement is in the book, incidentally. And then we come to February the 24th, 2012, which is not very long ago. Violent riots broke out at the Temple Mount in Jerusalem after Friday morning prayers. Crowds of Muslim worshippers threw stones at Israeli police and border guards and eventually entered the Al-Aqsa Mosque compound. Israel's news reported the riots broke out at the Temple Mount, and rioting was so extreme that a rare decision was made to send Israeli security forces in to the Al-Aqsa Mosque compound to use stun grenades to break up the hundreds of Muslim worshippers there. The riots were in reaction to the news that a large group of Jewish right-wing activists intended to enter the mosque to destroy the Al-Aqsa Mosque and the Dome of the Rock as part of the plan to build the third temple. The Al-Aqsa Mosque affair is actually called the Armageddon Project, which is very interesting in terms of what we've been talking about. And the hawks behind it come from the same source, that is the Round Table, from which come the bankers we have been discussing. And it just so happens a presidential advisor has named the hawks he holds responsible for 9/11, which ties together 9/11 and the present attempts at World War III. What can be said here is that people who have been involved in the Contra affair and various rather sinister things have also been involved in planning the destruction of the dome in Jerusalem and the building of a third temple. And I've put that information in the book. And I did certainly conclude that one or two people, 1% of our population, probably less, are taking the most enormous risks in the Middle East. Their policies are quite bizarre. And it is time really for Western people not only to signal that Middle Eastern people are just our fellow human beings and comrades, but to realize that there's a political religion around which is not doing anybody any good, that there is the traditional war-making banker involved in all this, and it's time for a lot of thought, a certain amount of action, a certain wariness about how Britain has become involved and on which side. And I should say it's also a time for a certain amount of prayer.
So what it all boils down to is that we're all busy watching all these little events, no, not so little events going on in the world, wars, crises, terrorist acts. But it's a bit like a magician. You're busy watching his trick, but you're not seeing what he's doing behind the scenes. And I think it all boils down to going back and seeing what is going on behind the scenes and taking it straight back to these bankers, to these corrupt individuals who are pulling all the strings and manipulating world events.
I think that's very true and very good. We've got to get to the point where the untouchables are touched. We've got to get to the base of all this unbridled greed and power, and we've got to get to the base of the subversion of news, media in general, and I have to say, to the subversion of democracy itself.